Christians at their best and at their worst. That's what we have in 3 John. The book of 3 John is a very small book. It is really one page in most Bibles. Not many verses, only 14 verses in the entire epistle of 3 John. 3 John is a kind of character study because we're presented with two Christians who really deserve our praise and commendation. There's one fellow in here, though, that deserves condemnation. So we commend two of the men, and one of the men serves as an example that we don't want to emulate. If you look at verse 11, he says, "Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does what is good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God." So these are the two extremes. And we are to imitate, he says, what is good, and do not imitate what is evil. There's a Christian presented here in verses 1 through 8. His name is Gaius. You may have heard him pronounced Gaius, but more properly Gaius. This is a Christian who deserves our commendation. He is an example of servanthood. He is a humble servant. We see gracious Gaius in that he's godly and he's also generous. We all need role models. I remember one time Charles Barkley made a famous statement. He said, "Don't look to me as your role model. I play basketball. Who am I to be your role model?" And he was making a good point that just because he was famous did not automatically make him someone that we ought to look to as a role model. But the fact remains that if you're famous, people will look up to you. And there is a responsibility. And so a lot of people who have the position that Charles Barkley had, whether they wanted it or not, they're still a role model. And if they act right, that's a good role model. Of course, if they're not acting very well, then they're a negative role model. But people need good role models. We're trying to live, and we look to others who are doing it right as examples of how to live. And of course, the ultimate role model is Jesus. He is an example. He suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. 1 Peter 2, verse 21. So he is the ultimate role model. But when Christians act right, live right, they act like the Christians they should be, they become our role models. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, Paul said, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." So long as Paul was following Christ, you could follow Paul because he was following Christ. We should want to be a kind of role model that people could follow us as we're following Christ. We are urged to be the kind of people that will make a difference in the world. Christians are called by Jesus light and salt. You're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth, Jesus said, Matthew 5, 14 through 16. So here we have two extremes in the book of 3 John. Two men who did it right, one who deserves to stand out in infamy. 3 John, we see successes and failures in the Christian life. And since we're trying to be faithful, we need to look at the men who did it right. Let's read verses 1 through 8 about gracious Gaius. John writes, "The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers, who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we may become fellow workers for the truth. So that's quite a commendation, isn't it? Here we see the soul of Gaius prospering. I love verse 2. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things. That'd be wonderful if we could prosper in all things. But he said that you may prosper and be in health. What if you could prosper and be in good health? That's wonderful. But notice how he qualifies it. He says, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as what? Just as your soul prospers. Now, what if the business, I don't know what business that you may be doing, but the business that you do, what if the standard of judgment was this? I hope your business does as well as your soul is doing. Would you want your business to do as well as your soul is doing? Well, look how he qualifies it. He says, I hope your physical health can be as good as your spiritual health. Because he was doing well spiritually. Maybe he was struggling physically. But he says, I pray that you'll be prospering in all things and be in good health, just as your soul prospers. Now, what is the soul? The soul, contrasted here with good health, is the inward man. It's the spiritual man. It's the part of us made in the image of God that will live forever. In fact, we can purify our souls in obeying the truth. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 22 and 23, he says, seeing then that you have purified your souls in obedience to the truth, or obedience to the truth, see that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. So purifying our souls. That's the inward man. Gaius had a soul, and we have a soul. Your soul is not your physical body. He says, I want your physical body to be healthy, but your soul to be also prospering. God's truth was in Gaius. Look at verse 3. For I rejoice greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you. And just as you walk in the truth, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Now, the truth purifies. It purifies the inward man, the soul. But truth also sanctifies. John 17:17, Jesus said, sanctify them in thy truth. Thy word is truth. So it makes us holy if we will follow the truth of God's word. The truth also edifies. It builds up. In Acts chapter 20, verse 32, he talks about commending them to the word of truth, which was able to build them up. And so the Word of God can build us up in our faith. Also, Ephesians 4:15 talks about the growth of the body, the growth of the church has to do with the truth. And so Gaius was one who walked in the truth. He was looking to live by the truth, to know the truth, and he had freedom because Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So Gaius practiced the truth. And verses 5 through 8, look at what he got done. Verse 5, verse 3, he says, Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers. You have who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward in their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. So Gaius practiced the truth. He did things for people. He did things, he says, about Gaius. He says, you do it for the brethren, verse 5, and you do it for strangers. You do it for the brethren and for strangers. So his love was an active one. His life was an example. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 18, John wrote, My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. In other words, don't just talk about what you're going to do or what would be the loving thing to do, but do it. Love is a verb. It gets things done. So love in deed and in truth, not word only, not just in tongue, but actually do it like Gaius did. He became a fellow worker by contributing to others who were doing work. There were others who were preaching and he was supporting. 3 John verse 8. Now, I wish the standard applied to Gaius could be the standard we always went by, because the standard applied to Gaius was, I hope that your health, your physical health, will be as good as your spiritual health. That's wonderful to think about. His spiritual health was so good that this is a good standard by which John could say, I wish you could be that healthy physically. Now, that's the one who needs our commendation. He had a great reputation because of this. But then there's disappointing Diotrephes. He's disappointing because he got lifted up with pride. In verse 9, it says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. The word preeminence means first place. This is a man who wanted to be number one. He wanted all the attention on Diotrephes. He wanted to take the place in the praise giving. He wanted that to be given to him. Instead of praising the Lord, praise Diotrephes. Instead of sharing commendation with those who deserved it, he tried to take it. He loved to have the preeminence. So verse 10, John writes, therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. Who does this man think he is? Putting people out of Christ's church. And he does not receive John and people like John who are faithful and who are recognized as the leaders sent by the Lord, and he's taking over because he loves to have the preeminence. Oh, the pride that he is demonstrating here. It's terrible. Demetrius had the witness of truth, and that's in verse 12, but Diotrephes, he is living against the grain of truth. Diotrephes is disappointing. The way we respond to the writings of the apostles shows our reception of them or our rejection of them. Look at verse 9. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. John says, I'm an apostle. I wrote to the church, but this Diotrephes, he's not receiving us. I've heard people say they will read the writings of Paul, and they will say, well, I would rather listen to Jesus than Paul. Or they'll read the writings of Peter and say, well, I'm going to listen to Jesus rather than Peter. But Jesus sent Peter and Jesus sent Paul. They were apostles that he sent on their special mission, and they had the witness and testimony of Jesus Christ. He had all authority on heaven and earth, in heaven and earth, and he sent them forth to preach to all nations. And people who reject the apostles' doctrine are rejecting the Lord himself. And that's what Diotrephes did. Diotrephes is disappointing to us, so unlike Gaius. When we become Christians, we're called to humility. We see the humility of Gaius. He was ready to serve others. But we see the pride of Diotrephes, who instead of denying himself, he wanted the preeminence. He wanted to put himself as number one. In Luke 9:23, Jesus said, if any man will be my disciple, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. That doesn't sound at all like Diotrephes. Diotrephes did not want a cross to carry every day. He did not want to say no or deny Diotrephes. He wanted the preeminence. So much so he was willing to deny the Apostle John. He was willing to put people out of the church. Diotrephes repudiated the principles of the Apostle John because John said, I wrote to the church, but he does not receive us. I don't know why Diotrephes was like he was. I don't know what caused him to want to have the preeminence among the brethren. It could have been that he felt insecure. He could have felt inadequate. And this was the place, the church, where he felt like he had some power. And so he demonstrated that I've got power, at least at church. That's very unfortunate. Or it may that he had a work situation where he felt powerless. And so he could leave work feeling powerless, come to church, and exert power. It could have been at home. He felt intimidated, maybe by an overbearing wife or children who would not listen or respect him, and it may have, for good reason on their part. But in this situation, he felt like maybe it could have been the situation where he felt like, well, at church, people listen to me, so much so that I can even have enough authority to put people out of the church. He may have aligned himself with false teachers. If you look at 2 John, verses 9 and 10, John said, whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ hath both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house nor greet him. Now it could have been that he disobeyed those verses and did align himself with false teachers. And if that is the case, then if a person is willing to compromise in one area, they might as well say, well, I can just take over the church. I can even be more important than the Apostle John. It's evident that he had not seen God. Look at verse 11. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. So he was a doer of evil. And John says the doer of evil has not seen God. So Diotrephes was not living right, and he was exerting power in the realm of the church. And it's very unfortunate because he was dividing the church. He was putting people out of the church. He did not have that authority. It would be like a shepherd coming into a sheepfold and saying, get out. You don't belong here. I'm going to have all these other sheep, but these sheep I don't like, they can get out. That was Diotrephes. That was his pride. And we are not to imitate people like him. But on the other hand, like commendable Gaius, there's dependable Demetrius. And if you look at verse 12, it says, Demetrius has a good testimony from all, and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. Now, who is this Demetrius? We read of a Demetrius in Acts 19, 23 through 29. Demetrius, the silversmith, he worked in Ephesus, and he was up to no good in Ephesus, at least the Demetrius we read about in Ephesus. Well, John himself had worked in Ephesus, and it could have been that he had a positive influence and converted Demetrius. Demetrius, who was against the Apostle Paul in Ephesus. We don't know if it's the same Demetrius. There may have just been two men with the same name. But let's just, for thinking's sake, let's say that it is the same Demetrius. If it is, it shows a tremendous conversion, one on the order and scale of the Apostle Paul, who as Saul of Tarsus persecuted the church. And yet when Jesus got his attention and he learned the truth, he changed. Jesus changed him. He obeyed the gospel. He was told to arise and be baptized and wash away his sins. calling on the name of the Lord, Acts 22:16, and the account in Acts 9 says he arose and was baptized, Acts 9:18. And so what a wonderful change the Apostle Paul made in his life. If this is the same Demetrius, it shows the power of the gospel in changing a man from one who made money in making idols to becoming a Christian and becoming very dependable. But whether it's the same man or not, this Demetrius had a good reputation. And since we're all sinners, and sinners can be converted and changed, become Christians by being born again, then this Demetrius that we have here in 3 John had gone through that. And as a Christian, he had developed a good reputation. Look at verse 12. Demetrius has a good testimony from all and from the truth itself. Now, let's think about that for a moment. What if the truth was your judge? Let's just imagine a courtroom scene, and the judge gets up on the judge seat, and from the judgment seat, we see that it's not a person, but it's truth. And truth is going to judge. And Demetrius is on trial. And when truth judges Demetrius, look how he comes out. A good testimony from all, that's the people that knew him, and from the truth. The truth judged him praiseworthy. In other words, it is a fact that his good testimony is rooted in truth. It's a fact. And so Demetrius is one that we can imitate. Imitate what is good. Don't imitate what is evil. People like Diotrephes. Demetrius had a good reputation. That's a good thing to have. Proverbs 22 verse 1 talks about a good name and the value of it. Shakespeare one time said, "He who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis something, nothing, 'twas mine, 'tis his, and has been slave to thousands. But he that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him and makes me poor indeed." He really had a way with words, didn't he, Shakespeare? But Demetrius had a good name, and it was not taken from him. In verse 12, we learn that he's a witness of the truth. Demetrius has a good testimony from all and from the truth itself. The truth was, he was the real, genuine man that everybody knew him to be. Now imagine that Demetrius not only had the brethren's recommendation and the truth testified to his reputation, but the rest of verse 12 says, "And we also bear witness." That's John. And the people with John said, "We bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true." When John writes these epistles, he writes to the church as "my little children." Paul had written to the church at Corinth as those that were like his children in the faith. Well, when he wrote to this younger generation, he said, "You know that our testimony is true." They knew that about the elder apostle John. He was not going to lie to them. And so he said, "What I'm telling you about Demetrius is true. What I'm telling you about Gaius is true. You can imitate them. But I'm warning you about Diotrephes. He is not dependable." Demetrius, with this good reputation, was able to be commended to the brethren. And if we maintain a good name, then we can get a good reputation and be commended for good things. Perhaps you've filled out some kind of a job application, and you got your, let's say, your resume together, and they said, "We want you to put forth some people who will testify to your reputation." And so we put them down as people who will give us a good word. Now, we're not asking them to make things up. Hopefully we've been the kind of people that they can tell the truth about us, and that be a good word concerning our reputation. A good recommendation goes a long way in getting a good job, maybe getting a loan at the bank. Sometimes people find a marriage partner because someone put a good word in for them. But there's no way to estimate the value of a good reputation. And Gaius had one, and Demetrius had one, but unfortunately, Diotrephes did not. Now, this letter closes with an emphasis on individuals. Read with me verses 13 and 14. He says, I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. Dale Carnegie used to say that the sweetest sound to a person's ear was their name. If you like your name and you appreciate what your parents did by giving you that name, what it means to you, it can be a sweet sound. Anyway, when people are calling on you, it shows you that there's importance, at least they're placing on you. Our president and those who are wanting to be president are campaigning, and they're meeting and speaking to millions of people. But there's just so many people that they can shake hands with. I read about Abraham Lincoln that just maybe a day or two before he was shot and assassinated, he went to a hospital and shook hands with every person in that hospital because he wanted to encourage them to heal from their wounds and to let them know that they were important. Even though they had been shot or they had been hurt in the Civil War, they were still valuable to the nation. And he would shake hands till his hands were sore. And a lot of politicians do that because they know the value of individual votes, because every person is a vote. Well, even more so, every person is important. The Apostle John by this time was very known, very famous. He was one of the original apostles. And he could write with pen and ink and reach people like we are reading this same letter in 2024. But he said, I have many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink. He wanted to see them face to face. And he also wanted them to have peace. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. Individuals. Individuals are important to God. Each individual has a soul. That's why it doesn't matter if the numbers are in the thousands or if there's just 2 or 3 gathered together in his name. Because God is concerned not with numbers so much as with every person has a soul. And Jesus died for people. He tasted death for every man. Hebrews 2 verse 9. Now, Matthew 16:26 says, what shall a man be profited if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Your soul, mark this down, your soul, Jesus says, is worth more than the whole world and everything in it. How valuable is your soul? Jesus died for you. The Son of God died for you. Think about that. Now, the New Testament not only represents individuals here, but it opens Matthew chapter 1 with a genealogy of Christ, mentioning all these individuals that took place in God's record of biblical history, bringing us to Christ. God always works through the individual, and individuals, of course, added together make the multitudes. Christianity is represented by individuals. That gets down to you and to me. We make a difference, and God can work with us and through us, but we need to be generous and servants like Gaius. We do not need to be selfish like Diotrephes. We need to be faithful and dependable like Demetrius. Another poet said, the lives of all great men remind us we too can make our lives sublime, and in departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. That's right. We can make a difference by the lives we live. We have a short letter here, but we're introduced to enough information to know Gaius and Diotrephes could say, imitate us, not Diotrephes, Demetrius. It's easy to get them mixed up. Gaius and Demetrius, they're saying, imitate us as we imitate Christ. But Diotrephes, although he would want us all to give him the preeminence, we're not to follow him in his folly. Yes, these are extremes, but Christians at their best and their worst are presented here for a reason. We are encouraged and urged strongly to emulate good people. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:33, he said, evil companionships corrupt good morals. That is a rule that many have broken and have been broken upon. We cannot immerse ourselves in this world and expect to come out other than being worldly. Jesus lived in the world, but he was not of the world. And he's called Christians to come out and be separate from the world, to live in the world as light and salt, but we are not to love the world and become worldly. In fact, we're called by John to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world, in the epistle of 1 John. So I commend to you these Christians at their best and worst. Let us imitate what is good, and let us not imitate what is evil. Good lessons there from the Apostle John. We're going to close the lesson now. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to respond. Any who are listening by internet who would like to respond, you can contact us at Randolph Church of Christ, Huntsville, Alabama, and we will be glad to look in God's Word and find the answers that we're looking for. We're going to stand now and sing.